1,315. They thought the worst part was already over when their swords were taken. For days the captured knights had been driven east under guard, wrists bound, armor stripped away piece by piece. No banners, no speeches, just boots on packed earth and the steady pressure of spear shafts at their backs. Every man among them expected the same end: a cold tower, a damp cell, maybe ransom if their family still had coin. But before they saw any walls, before any fortress rose to meet them, something else announced itself. Sound. Not shouting, not horns. A deep, repeating odor that came through the ground as much as the air. Slow, heavy, unbroken. It did not fade with distance. It grew stronger. One of the younger knights muttered a prayer. Another asked if it was thunder. An older man shook his head and said nothing. He knew storms did not keep time. As the road bent toward a river valley, smoke drifted low across the fields. Not the thin lines from hearth fires, but wide sheets of gray that hung over the land like fog that refused to lift. The smell followed soon after. Burned wood, hot iron, wet ash. It clung to the throat. The guards did not hurry them. That was the first sign this was no accident. They crossed the border stone at midday. The marker was plain, worn smooth by years of rain and boots. No ceremony. One guard tapped it with the butt of his spear and said, "You are past it now." Another laughed. No one looked back. The knights tried to keep their dignity. Some straightened their backs. Some whispered names of saints. One asked where they were being taken. A guard answered without turning, "You will see." The road widened as it dropped toward the river. Wagons passed them going the other way, wheels groaning under weight. Iron bars stacked like firewood. Crates marked in chalk. Bundles of finished spear shafts bound in twine. No one stopped to stare at the prisoners. No one slowed. That cut deeper than insults. The valley opened suddenly, and with it came the truth. What lay before them was not a town built around a forge. It was a place built for forging. Water channels cut clean lines through the earth, guiding the river into controlled paths. Wooden wheels turned without pause, lifting and dropping massive hammers that struck glowing metal again and again. Each blow landed with purpose. Each followed the last at the same steady pace. The knights were marched along the edge of it all. They saw lines of hearths burning side by side. Men worked in teams, not alone. One fed charcoal, one worked the bellows. Two swung sledges in rhythm, while a master watched the metal, not their faces. When the color was right, he called out. When it was wrong, the piece went back into the fire without complaint. No shouting, no wasted movement. The prisoners began to understand why no one rushed. Mail links lay in barrels, counted by weight. Arrowheads filled crates like grain at harvest. Horseshoes were stacked in neat piles, all the same size. Nails filled baskets by the thousands. Not trophies, not special orders. Stock. A clerk stood at a table under a simple awning, writing as pieces were delivered. Each mark meant something. Each mark meant more steel ready for use. One knight finally broke. "This is not how war is fought," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. A guard beside him answered, calm and almost polite. "It is how war is finished." That sentence stayed with them as they were led deeper along the road. They had trained all their lives to believe that skill, courage, and bloodline decided battles. Here, none of those things were in charge. The work did not stop for prayers. It did not pause for noble names. The march continued, but something had already shifted. They were still prisoners, still hungry, still afraid, but now they were also witnesses. And once you see how power is made, You can never unsee it. But the valley was only the beginning, and what waited ahead would strip away the last comfort they still carried about who truly controls a war. They were not taken inside at once. Instead, the guards slowed the march and turned the column along a raised path that overlooked the valley floor. It felt deliberate, as if the captors wanted the prisoners to see everything before they were allowed to rest their eyes. Below them, the work continued without pause. The river had been broken into channels, its flow guided by timber gates and stone-lined cuts. Each branch fed a different wheel. Each wheel served a purpose. Some drove heavy hammers that fell with enough force to flatten thick iron bars in a few strikes. Others powered grinding stones, where sparks flew in constant showers as blades were brought to shape. One knight whispered, "They never stop." "They do," a guard replied, "when the river freezes, or when there is no more wood." That answer carried no pride, just fact. The prisoners noticed details that frightened them more than noise or smoke. The iron arriving at one end of the valley was not raw. It had already been sorted, refined, and measured. Nothing came here by chance. Wagons unloaded blooms and bars according to markings burned into the wood. Teams took them away without argument. No shouting over who worked where, no wasted motion. They passed a yard where boys no older than 12 sorted mail rings by size, their fingers blackened and quick. Nearby, older men punched rivet holes with practiced blows, never lifting their eyes. At another hearth, a woman checked finished spearheads, running her thumb along the edge before setting them aside or tossing them back into the fire. One knight, his voice low, asked, "How many armies do you feed from this place?" The guard considered the question. "As many as are needed." They were led past storage sheds, guarded by men who carried no tools, only weapons. Inside, through open doors, the prisoners glimpsed order that felt almost cold. Racks of helmets, each marked with chalk, bundles of pikes laid out by length, barrels sealed and dated. This was not wealth meant to impress visitors. It was wealth meant to move. A clerk crossed their path, parchment tucked under his arm. He glanced at the knights, then at the guards. "These the ones from the west road?" The guard nodded. "Put them near the south sheds," the clerk said. "The noise helps them sleep less." The words landed harder than an insult. They were not special here. They were not enemies worthy of ceremony. They were simply bodies passing through a system already in motion. As they walked, one of the older knights spoke quietly to the man beside him. "In Milan, we wait months for a single harness to be finished." The man answered, eyes fixed on the valley. "Here they would finish 10 while you wait." That was when the truth settled in. This place was not built in response to war. It existed before the fighting reached these borders. The roads, the channels, the storage yards, the tallies, all of it had been planned during peace. The war had simply given it purpose. A bell rang somewhere down the line, not a church bell, short, sharp, a signal. One team stopped, another began. The rhythm never broke. One knight laughed under his breath, the sound brittle. "We were taught to fear their knights." The guard walking nearest him answered, "You feared the wrong men." As evening came, the light shifted, but the work did not slow. Torches were lit. Hearths burned brighter. The river kept turning the wheels. The prisoners were finally halted near a low building where the ground vibrated underfoot with each hammer blow. They sat. They ate thin broth. No one spoke for a long while. They had crossed into enemy land believing they understood power. Now they knew they had only seen its surface. But seeing the machine was one thing, and understanding what it meant for their own lives would come next, whether they were ready or not. The next morning came without announcement. No bell marked the hour. No prayer broke the dark. The work had never truly stopped, and waking into it felt like opening one's eyes inside a moving cart already rolling downhill. The knights were put back on their feet and marched along a narrower path that cut through the center of the valley. Here, there was no distance to soften the view. Heat pressed close. Ash drifted onto skin. The ground was packed hard by years of feet and wheels. They passed a line of men repairing damaged armor. Breastplates dented by blows were reheated, reshaped, and quenched. Mail torn open by axe strikes was unraveled, repaired, and re-riveted. Nothing was treated as ruined, only delayed. One knight stopped walking. A guard shoved him forward, but the knight spoke before the spear touched his back. "That helm," he said, pointing. "I fought a man wearing one like it." The smith did not look up. "You probably did." "It split," the knight said. "I saw it break." The smith nodded once, still working. "Then it came back here." That exchange said more than any threat could. They were led into a long shed open on both sides. Inside, weapons were laid out not by owner or rank, but by type and stage of completion. Blades awaiting grinding, blades awaiting hilts, blades finished and stacked, ready to be issued. A clerk walked the length of the rows, checking counts against his tablet. One of the prisoners whispered, "They do not even name them." A guard answered, "Why would they?" For these men, steel was not a symbol. It was a resource, used, reused, replaced. A younger knight finally spoke what many had been thinking. "Where are your champions, your great fighters?" A guard smiled, thin and tired. "Somewhere out there. Some are dead. Some will be soon. It changes nothing." The prisoners were shown a training yard near the riverbank. Recruits practiced with identical spears, drilled in lines that moved as one. No individual flourishes, no calls for glory. When one man faltered, another stepped into his place without pause. One knight, his voice heavy, said, "At home, we fight to be remembered." The reply came quickly. "Here, men fight to be replaced." That was the moment when anger flared among the captives. Not rage born of pain, but something sharper. Insult. Everything they had been taught, every story of honor passed down through halls and hearths, felt small under the weight of what they were seeing. One man spat on the ground. "This is not knightly war." A guard stopped and turned fully toward him. "No," he said, "it is winning war." They were marched past a row of wagons being loaded for departure. Each was marked with destination names scratched into wood. Passes, bridges, border keeps. The system extended far beyond the valley. This place fed fronts the prisoners had never even seen. An older knight spoke quietly, almost to himself. "We charge. They resupply." No one corrected him. As the sun climbed, the knights felt something worse than fear take hold. Realization. They had always believed that if they survived long enough, ransom would save them. But what was a knight worth in a land where armor could be made faster than it could be paid for? One of them finally asked the question no one wanted answered. "Why show us this?" The guard looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because men fight differently when they understand why they are losing." The march resumed. Their chains felt heavier now, not because of weight, but because of what those chains represented. They were no longer symbols of capture. They were proof of irrelevance. But the deepest cut was still ahead, when they would learn how closely power, control, and obedience were tied together in this place. They were moved at midday when the heat was highest and the valley smelled of sweat, ash, and hot metal. This time the guards took them away from the open yards and into enclosed ground. Low walls funneled movement. Gates stood where roads met. Nothing here was grand, but everything had a purpose. The knights noticed how few guards were posted and how little noise they made. Order did the work for them. They entered a long building with a roof of dark timber. Inside, the air was cooler. Tables filled the space, each covered in parchment, wax seals, weights, and measures. Men sat with quills, their fingers stained black, their eyes sharp. This was not a place of fire and muscle. This was where iron became power. A clerk looked up as the prisoners were brought in. "These are the Western captures?" "Yes," a guard answered. The clerk studied them as one might study livestock, not cruelly, efficiently. "How many survived the march?" "All." "Good," the clerk said. "Feed them. No injuries. Broken men cost time." That sentence hung in the air. One knight stepped forward despite the chains. "You treat us like tools." The clerk did not bristle. "Of course. Tools break, tools are repaired, tools are replaced." A guard moved to strike him, but the clerk raised a hand. "No, let him speak." The knight swallowed. "You show us your forges, your counts, your stores. Why?" The clerk leaned back. "Because fear works best when it is informed." They were led from the counting hall to a fenced yard where finished goods waited under guard. Here, everything was marked. Dates, destinations, quantities. Mistakes were scratched out and corrected. Nothing was erased. One of the knights recognized a mark burned into a crate. "That pass," he said. "We fought there last winter." "Yes," the clerk replied. "You held it for 3 weeks." "And lost it," the knight said. The clerk nodded. "Because you ran out of points and shoes. We did not." That was how this war was spoken of, not in songs or boasts, in shortages and delays. As they walked, the knights noticed something else. Workers did not argue. Orders were given once. Disobedience was rare enough to stand out. When a man missed a count, another corrected him quietly. When a tool broke, it was replaced without comment. One knight whispered, "They fear someone." The guard heard him. "Everyone does?" They were shown a holding yard where prisoners from other fronts worked under watch. Some were peasants, some were soldiers. All wore the same plain tunics. No one wore chains. "They work?" one knight asked. "They earn food," the guard replied. "And time." "For what?" another asked. "For the war to end," the guard said. "Or for them." The implication needed no explanation. As evening drew near, a master smith approached the group. His hands were scarred, his voice was steady. "You were taught that honor decides battles." No one answered. He continued, "Honor decides how men feel about losing. Control decides who loses." One knight laughed bitterly. "You think we will serve you?" The master looked at him. "Some of you will. Some will die refusing. Both outcomes are acceptable." That was fear without shouting. Fear built into the structure of the place itself. They were returned to their holding area as night fell. Fires still burned, wheels still turned. Tallies were still made by torchlight. The knights lay awake, listening. They had been raised to believe power wore armor and rode horses. Now they knew it also carried ledgers and keys. But the true weight of what they had learned would only settle when the road took them away from the valley and forced them to carry its lesson with them. They left the valley at dawn. No ceremony marked their departure. The guards simply formed up and pushed them back onto the road, away from the river and the smoke. Behind them, the wheels kept turning. Ahead of them, the land rose into quieter hills. For a long time, no one spoke. Each knight carried the same thought, though none wanted to say it aloud. The war they believed they were fighting no longer existed, or perhaps it never had. What they had seen in the valley was not cruelty for its own sake. It was something colder, a way of thinking that treated victory as a matter of planning rather than chance. One of the younger knights finally broke the silence. "If they can make all that," he said, "why bother taking us at all?" An older man answered him, "Because men talk, and men remember." The road narrowed. Fields replaced workshops. The smoke thinned, but it did not leave their minds. Each hammer strike they had heard seemed to echo with every step. As the day wore on, a guard riding alongside them spoke, not unkindly. "You were raised to believe war is decided when two lines meet." A knight looked up. "Is it not?" The guard shook his head. "War is decided months earlier, by who stored enough iron, by who cut enough wood, by who kept their men fed when the roads froze." No one argued. They stopped near a stream at midday. The knights drank and sat in the dirt. Their hands were still bound, but loosely now. Escape did not cross their minds. Where would they go? Back to castles that could not replace a broken helm before the next season? One knight stared at the water and spoke softly. "My father spent his life perfecting a sword grip." Another answered, "Mine spent his hoarding coin for ransom." Both fell silent. What they had seen did not erase courage. It did not make skill worthless, but it showed how fragile those things were when standing alone. A brave man without equipment is still unarmed. A skilled rider without a horse still walks. As evening came, the guard captain addressed them for the first time. "Some of you will be ransomed," he said. "Some will work. Some will not survive captivity. None of that changes what you saw." He paused. "You have looked at the spine of this war." That night, lying on hard ground, the knights understood the final lesson. The Smithies were not built to break enemies. They were built to support their own people through long struggle. The war was being won not by hatred, but by patience and preparation. When morning came, the march resumed toward distant holding towns. The valley disappeared behind the hills, but it followed them all the same. In time, stories would spread. Knights would speak less of charges and more of supply roads. Lords would begin asking different questions. Some would listen, some would not. And that was the point. History does not favor the loudest or the bravest. It favors those who prepare when no one is watching. That is the lesson these knights carried forward, whether they wished to or not. And it is a lesson that still matters. Because strength is not only what you show in the moment of struggle, it is what you quietly build long before the struggle begins. If this story made you rethink how power really works, take a moment to reflect on where preparation matters in your own life. Support work that values patience over spectacle, and remember that the foundations you build today decide the battles you face tomorrow.